We are so lucky to have our guest with us today, but before I introduce him, I want to make sure that we give a couple of thanks and appreciation to the people who have helped make Writers Week possible. So I would like to give a special recognition to our Booster Club and all of your parents and community members that helped to support all of the school's events, but especially Writers Week. Writers Week would not happen without Mr. Anderson and Mrs. Ang, so I'd like to give a special recognition to them for just making storytelling possible for so many years. And of course, a part of the storytelling is the audience who is receiving that story and the community that we have together while we share with professional writers or our fellow students. And so I'm going to thank you in advance for being an engaged and respectful audience member today. It is my very, very big pleasure to introduce you our next guest. This, for those of you who are not familiar with what the Pulitzer is, this past week we had the Grammys, which we know are the biggest award in music, and Tonys are for the stage production, and the Golden Globes and Emmys for television and movies. But the Pulitzer is the biggest award for literature and journalism. And we have a recipient here with us today, and so it is a very big deal. Jonathan Eig has written many books, which he's going to tell you about today, but he won the Pulitzer in 2023 for, it's a fast 600 pages. It was very fast, it was very good, on Martin Luther King Jr. called King, A Life. And so he's going to talk to you about many things, but I'm sure he's going to touch on this book. I would like to have you help me in welcoming Jonathan Eig to the stage right now.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here for Writers Week. You guys are so lucky to have Writers Week, and it's my second time participating. So I want to tell you a little bit about my journey as a writer, because it began at around this age that most of you are. I began, and I'll tell you a little bit about my books and about the King book in particular. But my journey as a writer began when I was about 16 years old, working for my high school newspaper and deciding that I loved what I was doing. And I also sort of, at that same age, talked my way into a job at my local newspaper, which was in suburban New York. And I just said I would do anything they wanted me to do. And I sat and answered phones and took calls and typed stuff for them and filed papers and whatever. Eventually, they started letting me cover high school sports and even some city council meetings. But I found, as a newspaper reporter, even for my high school newspaper, that the notebook helped me overcome a lot of my fears and my anxieties and my shyness. You know, your journalism instructor lent me one of these. So I felt like this was my key to overcoming my shyness, my inhibition. I felt like this was a passport that opened up worlds to me, because when I had this notebook in my hand, I wasn't afraid to talk to people. And when I wrote stories, I had time to think about what I wanted to say and to sound smarter than I really was. And I also could ask questions and investigate things that would not have been available to me otherwise. So as a reporter, even for my high school paper, I could make an appointment with the principal and say, why was this club canceled? You know, why doesn't the school have enough money for sport that they used to have? You know, it was just a great way to think about privilege of who gets to ask the questions and who gets to decide what stories get told. And that's such an important story, such an important issue, right? We can all pursue our stories. We can write what we want to write. We can do what we want to write. It begins, though, with giving yourself permission. Because before anybody else can shut you down, you have to give yourself permission to do something. So for me, having that notebook was the key, was the passport. And that's all I wanted to do. I just thought that I was going to be a newspaper reporter for my whole life. And I thought that the newspaper industry was the safest industry I could possibly go into, because newspapers were making tons of money. Every big city had at least 2 newspapers. And when I graduated from Northwestern with a degree in journalism, it was easy to find jobs. The question was just like, which city did you want to go to? And I found a job in New Orleans. At that point, I had not been anywhere. So again, thinking about this notebook as a passport, I had never left the country. I don't think I'd ever been on a plane until I went to college. And moving to Louisiana and being assigned to this small town that I was supposed to cover was just like a really eye-opening experience for me. I was very inexperienced, very naive, and I just found that like I could go anywhere and do anything and learn anything I wanted to. I had an idea one time that the city, if you've ever been in New Orleans, has these streetcars that run throughout the city. But I think it's from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m., there's only one train, one trolley running throughout the entire city of New Orleans. And I thought, I wonder who rides that. And I asked my editor, could I just ride that trolley from 2 to 4 every night for a couple of weeks and see what happens? And they said, sure. Like, they'd let you do anything back then with your notebook, and they'd let you write a story about it. And I just felt this incredible sense of curiosity, this incredible sense of freedom. I remember one of my first jobs, I was covering this little town called Jean Lafitte. It was a very small fishing village, and I would go to the city council meetings, and at one of the city council meetings, they said, well, the high school class only had something like 10 students left in it because everybody had dropped out to work as a shrimp fisherman, to work with their parents on their shrimp boats. And I thought, wow, what does a shrimp boat look like? How do you catch shrimp? They're so small. And I just said to my editor, I'm going to go see if I can find a shrimp boat that I can ride around on, and I'll write a story about why all these high school kids are dropping out to become shrimp fishermen. And that was to me, it was the greatest job in the world. Like, I get to just explore and write about anybody. Somebody's going to let me on their boat and let me help them, help teach me how to fish for shrimp, just because I asked. There's a great lesson there in that if you are curious about something and you decide to pursue it, who's going to stop you? If you don't stop yourself, there's a pretty good chance you're going to get a shot at it. And to me, the key was finding good ideas, finding things that I was excited about. And think about this too. I know that when you write a paper, whether it's a history paper, an English paper, or whether you're beginning a new science project, what do you prefer? Do you prefer for your teacher to assign you something, or do you prefer to be allowed to pick your own ideas? And often your happiness and your success and your interest in this project depends on whether you made a good choice, whether you picked something that you were excited about learning about and sustained your interest and became better and better as you got into it. And that's really how I began to make the transition from writing newspaper stories to writing books. I began to feel like I had this opportunity to write about whatever I wanted. And the newspapers would generally let me do what I wanted as long as I kept coming up with good ideas. And the really good ideas would get on the front page. So what does it take to come up with an idea that's so good that you might even be able to write a book about it? One of the things that happens with newspaper work is that you're writing sometimes 2 or 3 stories a day. And you dream of having a whole week to work on one story. Wouldn't that be luxurious? But imagine having years to work on one story, to tell a book, to write a book that would take you several years. And I began thinking that maybe I could do it. After a while, I'd built up the muscles. I knew that I could write a good newspaper story. I built up the muscles to the point where I knew I could write a magazine story, which is a lot longer, something like 5,000 to 10,000 words. A book is 100 to 200,000 words. Could I do that? Well, I learned how by reading books. And this is the other thing, if you're passionate about something, of course you want to read how others do it. You want to learn how the tricks that they're learning. You want to be able to copy. I found myself copying the writers that I liked a lot. Not plagiarizing them, but trying to imitate their styles. Just like, if there's somebody who you admire as a celebrity, you try to dress like them. Or maybe you have a classmate who you think is really fashionable and you find yourself trying to dress like them, right? Or a big sister, a big brother. I would try to write like the writers that I admired. In fact, my 4th book was a book about how the birth control pill was invented. And the first sentence of that book is absolutely a tribute to Hemingway. It rhymes, it parallels in structure the first sentence of The Old Man and the Sea. And I think that's how you learn to be a better writer. It's how you learn to be better at anything, is by copying and learning from the people you admire. And I began reading books thinking about how they're written and how they're structured and how they're researched. What would it take? And there was one book in particular that really launched my book writing career. It was Seabiscuit by Laura Hillenbrand. Has anybody read it? Seen the movie? Anyway, it's a great book. And what really struck me was that it was so much better than any sports book I'd ever read. Sports books tend to be all about sports, but this book was about the Great Depression, and the horse racing was just a vehicle for helping you, making you root for these underdogs during the Great Depression. And over the course of dinner with my wife one night, I was telling her about why I love Seabiscuit so much, and I began to think about and to talk about how I could steal Seabiscuit, write my own Seabiscuit. What would that look like? What subject would I need to choose? I need a sports figure, because sports figures are really well documented. There's lots of primary source material. They did lots of interviews. There are reporters covering every game they play. So that helps me build some of the building blocks I need. But I need something that's bigger than sports. I need a story that's about something that everyone should care about. And just over the course of dinner with my wife, I said, Lou Gehrig, for example. I'm a big baseball fan. Lou Gehrig was the greatest first baseman in history, probably still the greatest first baseman to ever play the game. And when he was 35 years old, he was the strongest man in baseball, built like an ox, never missed a game, played 2,130 consecutive games without ever taking a day off. At age 35, he found out he was dying of this neurological disease that we now call Lou Gehrig's disease. How did he handle that? What happens when you're at in the prime of your life, strong, healthy, young, on top of the world, the handsomest man in the major leagues, the best player in the game, and you find out that you've got a year to live? What do you do? How do you go through with that? I thought that's a great book. And right there is probably the key moment in my professional life, because I had a couple things that I could have done at that point. I could have said, well, I don't know how to write a book. I don't have Lou Gehrig's family's permission to write a book. I don't know where I'd even begin to get an agent or a publisher. It's probably too much. But in that moment, my wife said, why don't you try? I said, yeah, why not? What's the worst that could happen? I fail. I go back to my newspaper writing career. And I spent a year working on what turned out to be a 130-page proposal. And I sent it out into the world. And I said, I want to write a book about Lou Gehrig. You don't know me, but look, I've written a lot of newspaper stories, so I think I can figure out how to write a book. And I found a publisher who was willing to take a chance on me. Why? Because I'd written thousands of newspaper stories, so they thought I might be able to figure out how to write a book, but also because I had a good idea. It turns out that this was a really smart, marketable idea. I wasn't thinking about a business strategy, but there's a lot of baseball fans out there who like books. There's a lot of Yankee fans in particular. There hadn't been a good biography of Lou Gehrig yet. There are a lot of people who struggle with Lou Gehrig's disease, or people who've lost a family member to Lou Gehrig's disease. So it turns out there's a market for this book. And then I decided, okay, now I've got a book contract. I have to figure out how to do this. And I've never taken a class in writing books. There are no online workshops at this point. I got to figure it out by doing it. And all this time that I'm doing this, I have this fear, and I still have this fear when I write a book, that I'm going to be exposed as a fraud, that I don't really know what I'm doing, and that I'm going to be judged in public. The New York Times is going to print a review of my work, and that's worse than getting a grade from your teacher, because the whole world is going to read about my failure, that I wrote a really lousy biography of Lou Gehrig. So I'm motivated by that fear. I'm still motivated by that fear. And I just had to work as hard as I possibly could, not just to learn how to write a book, but to make this the best book possible. And that means a lot of research. Each book takes me at least 3 or 4 years. The King book took me 6 years. And in the course of my Gehrig research, I found, because I'm insane about research. I want to make sure that when I write this book, nobody's going to come along and write another book for a long time, because I found everything about Lou Gehrig that you could possibly find. Same thing about Muhammad Ali was the subject of my 5th book. I spent 5 years on that one. I counted every punch that Ali was hit with. I watched every fight, and I counted every punch. I sponsored a scientist to study how those punches affected Ali's brain by charting his speaking ability. We analyzed his speaking rate month by month, year by year throughout Ali's career to see how much his speech was slowing down as a result of all the punches he was taking to the head. In the case of Lou Gehrig, because I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, in the case of Lou Gehrig, I found 200 pages of letters that he wrote to his doctor as he was dying that nobody had seen before. And that brought Gehrig to life in a way that no one had ever seen him. And it made the book a big bestseller and allowed me to continue writing books. That really is really the turning point in my career, finding those letters. And I want to pause for a second and talk about this idea of finding those letters, because you might ask yourself, what gives a biographer the right to tell someone's story? Like, what gave me the right to pry into Lou Gehrig's life and to read his private letters that he wrote to his doctor? He didn't ask me to be his biographer. Muhammad Ali didn't ask me to be his biographer. In fact, his wife wasn't that excited about the idea. And I think that it carries an enormous responsibility and humility to know that you can never really know your subject, and you have to do your best and work your hardest to try to figure out what made that person special, what made them think that they could do what they did. I remember I interviewed one of Muhammad Ali's friends, Dick Gregory, who's a famous comedian and activist, and he said to me, if you're going to write a book about Ali, first of all, as a white man, you have a special challenge, because you need to understand what made a black kid, same age as Emmett Till, think he could talk back and get away with it. What made him think he could call himself the greatest? What made him think he could call out white racism and not get killed for it? You got to explain what in his personality, in his childhood, in his character, made him think that he could get away with it and not get killed. And that's the challenge with any book, with any biography. I cannot tell you who Martin Luther King really is. I can just give you the best evidence of who he seemed to be and let you as the reader judge whether you feel like you got to know him by the end of this book. And that requires enormous hard work, but also humility, knowing that there is no answer. I couldn't write an honest biography about my brother or my mother or father, because there's always stuff going on in their minds that we don't know, and a biography is destined to be a failure in that way, right? That my job is to fail as little as possible with each of these books. So after taking on Muhammad Ali, which I thought would be by far the biggest book of my life and career, I mean, he was arguably the most famous man of the 20th century. He was my idol as a kid. And I just didn't think there would ever be a subject bigger than Ali that I would dare to attempt. But in the course of working on Ali, I found myself interviewing and meeting and spending time with people like Dick Gregory, John Lewis, Harry Belafonte, Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, these legends. And I was asking them, what was it like to be around Martin Luther King? One of the things you do as a biographer, it's really kind of annoying, is you just say, tell me what it was like to be in the room with him. Right? It's a great open-ended question. Try asking your mom, what was it like to be in the room with grandma? And don't let her off the hook when she says, oh, I don't know. We just watched TV. No. What was it like to be in the room? Where did she sit? Tell me about her body language. Just keep drilling that question until it drives them crazy. Like, what did they smell like? What did they smell like at the end of the day? Did they smoke? Where did they put the ashtray? I would do this with people who hung out with Martin Luther King. And I learned things that like blew my mind. And this is I'm not even working on the King book yet. But I learned that like he smoked cigarettes, that he would take off his shoes and sit on the floor and sing along with the record player. I learned that he and his best friend Ralph Abernathy wore the same cologne and the same brand of shoes. Like, that tells you something about best friends, doesn't it? I found it so interesting to start thinking about Martin Luther King as a person. That one of the things that we've done, and this is something that his friends said to me, they said the national holiday was the worst thing that ever happened to their friend Martin. Why would they say that the national holiday was the worst thing that ever happened to their friend Martin? Anybody have a thought? Well, they felt like it had dehumanized him, and that it had watered down his message, that we know I have a dream, and that's all we know about the guy. And we've forgotten how radical he was. We've forgotten how religious he was. We've forgotten that he had feelings, that he felt like a failure sometimes. We've forgotten that he wasn't even born Martin Luther King, he was born Mike King. We've forgotten that he was deeply religious. Even we sometimes talk about Dr. King and forget that he was Reverend King. We've forgotten that he attempted suicide twice as a teenager, that he suffered from mental health struggles his whole life, that he was hospitalized more than a dozen times for anxiety. His wife called it depression. So I just thought, here was an opportunity. I don't know if I'm the right guy. I don't know if I'm good enough to write Martin Luther King's biography. Like, this is even bigger than Muhammad Ali. What gives me the right to tell this story? But I had John Lewis and Harry Belafonte and Jesse Jackson saying somebody needs to do a new biography about King. And I might not be the perfect person to do it, but maybe I'm good enough. And if I work really hard at it, and if all these people help me, maybe I could help people relate to Martin Luther King in a way that changes our understanding of this man and makes him more real for us again. And one of the things I was most afraid of was that I'm going to have to talk about his flaws. And this is a man that we venerate, that we treat as a saint, that many people have pictures of Jesus and Martin Luther King on their walls in their living room. Like, I'm going to talk about his flaws, his mental health struggles, his marital infidelity. That's scary. But I decided to pursue it because I felt like this was the most important thing that I could do. And again, these books take me 5 or 6 years. You really have to ask yourself, is this worth the amount of time that I'm going to spend on this? Will people be interested in this? If I write a book and nobody reads it, and I spend 5 years on it, I'm going to feel foolish. Now, that's not to say that I'm not going to do it if I feel passionate about it. I wrote a book about the invention of the birth control pill. I mentioned that earlier. And my editors didn't think that it was going to sell. They didn't want me to do it. They offered me a very small amount of money in the contract, but I decided to do it anyway because I thought it was so important. And that book's actually going to be staged as a play this fall in Chicago, so come see my play. I didn't write it, but it's based on my book. But anyway, these are the factors that you think about when you're choosing a subject. And you're trying, and I think this should be true for all of us. If you're going to be passionate about something, if you're going to major at something in college, or if you're going to write a master's thesis, or if you're going to write your senior thesis, it should be something you care about, that you're going to find interesting, and that hopefully is going to become more interesting over time, and that you're going to teach yourself new things as you go along. And I just thought that the King project, if I could do it, would be far and away the most important thing that I could spend my time on. And I began by interviewing hundreds of people who knew him. I mean, what a thrill to meet people who met Martin Luther King. I had one person, she passed away recently, June Dobbs, who became my friend. And I got goosebumps thinking that, like, my friend was Martin Luther King's friend. They grew up together. They lived on the same block in Atlanta on Auburn Avenue. And what a thrill to be able to help tell this person's story. In addition to that, you'd think that, and again, I want to encourage you all to give yourself permission to try things. You'd be surprised what you can get away with. You'd be surprised what you can find where you can make an impact in ways that others haven't made before. You would think that someone like Martin Luther King has been very well documented. There's not going to be anything new to say on him. There's a whole department at Stanford dedicated to the study of Martin Luther King. There are at least a dozen college professors who've been working their whole lives researching King and the Civil Rights Movement. There have been other books, hundreds of books written about Martin Luther King before. And here I come with nothing but my notebook and a journalism degree. And I found things about Martin Luther King that nobody had discovered before. I found thousands of pages of new archival materials. It turns out King had a personal archivist, a man named Lawrence Dunbar Reddick, who was with him all the way from Montgomery to Memphis, his whole career, traveled with King everywhere, it was just Lawrence Dunbar Reddick and Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King on a months-long trip to India. He's taking notes everywhere they went. He's writing down what songs are being sung in church. He's writing down what seat they're sitting on in the airplane and what they eat. His papers were in boxes at a library that had never been opened. Coretta Scott King, when her husband died after the assassination, began working on a book. She worked with a ghostwriter. I found the tapes that she made in the ghostwriter's papers. I'm nobody special. I'm just working hard. I have 6 years. I'm going to knock on every door. I'm going to go through people's basements. I went to Muhammad Ali's second wife house. Khalila is her name. She lived in Deerfield, Florida, and she said she thought she might have a box of letters in the house. And to me, that's gold, right? Primary source material on one of the most famous men on the earth, letters that nobody had seen before. So I went to her house. It was Christmas Day. She's Muslim, I'm Jewish. We both had nothing to do. And I cleaned her entire apartment for her. I emptied out every closet. I went under her bed. Finally, under the bed, literally, the last box I pulled out under her bed was a pile of letters about this high. And again, this is history being made. I'll give you one more example, and I'm going to leave some time for questions. We all know Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. Their relationship is depicted as one of being maybe foes. I think it's safe to say that they were seen as having opposing views on the approach to civil rights. And in fact, Malcolm X was pretty caustic in his attacks on Martin Luther King, called it the farce on Washington, called him Reverend Dr. Chicken Wing. He liked to portray himself as the more dangerous alternative, and he liked to portray King as this white man's hero, nonviolent, equating nonviolence with weakness. But James Baldwin wrote that toward the end of their lives, they were almost indistinguishable in their philosophies. And we only have one, in fact, Malcolm X sought out Dr. King in Selma, and when he got there, King was in jail, so they didn't get to talk. But Malcolm X, we only have one really negative quote about Malcolm X from Martin Luther King. In this article in an interview he did for Playboy magazine, he said that Malcolm X's fiery oratory brought nothing but pain and grief for black Americans. And it was the longest interview King ever gave. So I decided I wanted to read the original interview. I wanted to hear the tapes, if possible, or at least read the transcripts of those tapes to see what else might have been said. And it turned out, I found the transcripts at the Duke University Library, where Alex Haley's papers were. Alex Haley conducted the interview. And it turns out Martin Luther King never said that. When asked about Malcolm X, he said, "I think we're both fighting for black dignity." And the magazine changed the quote. So I would encourage you, for me, the moral of the story is I've got 6 years to write a book. I'm going to check everything. For you, the question is, don't trust everything you read. Ask your own questions. Look for primary sources. In journalism school, they teach us if your mother says she loves you, check it out. So check these things out. I was able to find out things about Martin Luther King that even his own family didn't know. And in doing this story and researching his life, I was really able to, I think, help create a better understanding. My job in taking you along on this journey of this book is to try to help you imagine being in his shoes. This is a guy who begins leading the civil rights movement at age 26. He's 26 years old. The Montgomery bus boycott begins. He's new in town. He's got a new church. He's got a 2-week-old baby at home. So put yourself in his shoes. He gets the call saying, "Would you come to a meeting? We're thinking about protesting the buses. Rosa Parks was just arrested." And his reaction was, "No, I'm too busy." A very human reaction, not the heroic response that we would expect. I want you to think about that guy, because then he thinks about it and he says, "Okay, I'll go to the meeting." And then they ask him if he'll speak at the meeting. "Okay, I'll speak at the meeting." And he speaks at that meeting, and nobody's heard of him. The people of Montgomery don't know who Martin Luther King is. He's just this guy. He's not impressive. He's not a big guy. He's my height, actually. Until he starts to speak. And then suddenly everything changes. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. Why? Because Martin Luther King showed people how to overcome their fear. It was fear, for the most part, that kept segregation in place. Black people were afraid to step out. In fact, when the Montgomery bus boycott began, Klan membership doubled overnight. The mayor and the police chief joined the Klan. This is what they were up against, but King showed them how together they could stand up to authority, stand up to racism. And that message of hope that message of belief in God, belief in the democracy. He said to the people that night, that first night when he spoke, that if we're wrong in demanding justice, then the Supreme Court is wrong. The Bible is wrong. The Constitution is wrong. We're right. And that message resonated with people all over the country, all over the world, and launched him on this journey. Only 12 and a half years, because he would be dead at age 39. But along the way, I wanted to tell the story of somebody who was not this fait accompli. He was not destined to be the man at the March on Washington. It was complicated. He struggled. He failed over and over again. After the March on Washington, I know there's some good history students in here. What's the next big event for King in the civil rights movement? It's not really until Birmingham that he has another big triumph, and that's 6 years later. So in between, what's he doing? He's failing. Let's remember the King who failed. Let's remember the King who had fears, who called his college professor and said, I don't know what to do. They're expecting miracles from me. Let's remember that human King. And let's remember that his own government was trying to destroy him along the way. After the March on Washington, when we seem to be coming together, we seem to have this plan to go forth, and even the white newspapers are saying, we can do this. We can put racism behind us. The next day, the FBI sends out a memo saying that given the March on Washington, given King's speech, we must now consider him the most dangerous man in America. And they begin wiretapping his phones, wiretapping his hotel rooms, and trying to find evidence that will ruin him. In fact, at one point, they send a letter to King's home saying that he's going to be exposed for his sexual infidelities if he doesn't commit suicide. That's our government that does that. Imagine the pressure he was under. I wrote this book because I wanted you to feel that pressure. I wanted you to know that by the time he gets to Memphis in 1968, he feels like no one cares about him anymore. He feels like he's a complete failure. And we can listen, and I have thousands of pages of his transcripts of his phone calls. We can read what he's saying to his friends in his private moments when he's saying that no one's listening to me anymore. I don't know what to do next. And yet he goes to Memphis. Why? Because there's a sanitation workers strike? Like, is that really important enough for Martin Luther King? But he says it is important because these are God's children, and this is what he's fighting for. He's beginning to plan his most ambitious rally of all, the Poor People's Campaign. He's going to not going to stop talking about race, but he's going to expand his dream to income inequality, to workers' rights, to guaranteed income, guaranteed jobs. He's going to attack the fundamentals of capitalism and say that we need to do better to create a more just society where everybody, not just the rich, are lifted up. And that's why he's in Memphis. And it's in Memphis, of course, that he's killed. He gives his last speech of his life. He talks about how lucky he feels to have been alive in this time, to have seen the progress, to have seen the struggle, and to have been a part of it. But he says, I may not live a long life. I'd like to. Longevity is a blessing, but that doesn't matter for me anymore. He just wants to do God's will, he says. And the next day, he's standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, and his driver says to him, why don't you go back in and get a jacket? And King says, okay, I will. And those were his last words. Okay, I will. And to be honest, when I wrote that, it never even occurred to me how powerful that was. It was a reader who said to me, I can't believe his last words were, okay, I will. And that's when it hit me, after the book was already out, that was the message that King gave us all his life. He wasn't sure he wanted to get involved, but he did. And that's the message I'll leave you with today. We don't have to be Dr. King to be a hero. We all have to do our part, to tell our stories, to find our passion, to work on what interests us the most, and to not let your own doubts, your own fears stop you. For me, this helps. It's my little shield. It gets me over my inhibitions. Find your shield. Go out in the world and do what you think is the most important. And whether it's writing or science or anything, if you're passionate about it, give yourself permission to say, okay, I will. Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. And I left some time for questions, so please, I can tell from the brilliant faces in the audience there are going to be some good questions. Yeah, I see one right there.
What was your favorite thing you uncovered about him?
Favorite thing I uncovered about King? That's a really good question. The fact that the little things, I think, made me the happiest. That, like, he chewed his fingernails, and then he would shout at game shows on TV. Or his friend June told me that when they came home from school, he had a housekeeper, which tells you something about how he was raised. He had a housekeeper who would make them white bread with butter and sugar on top as their snack when they came home from school. I loved finding those little details that brought him to life. Yes? Good question. Would I ever consider writing a biography of Malcolm X? I absolutely would, except that there were two really good ones recently, and you have to look around the marketplace and see, like, is there room for something new? Is there enough new to say? Can I add something to our understanding of Malcolm X? But there are two really solid recent biographies, and I'm just not sure that I would make enough of a difference with mine. Like, how much better could mine really be? So it'd have to be, if I found some new trove of materials, if I found his private diaries or something like that, maybe, then I would say, okay, there's enough. This changes our understanding of Malcolm X. It's a high bar that you'd have to cross for that one. If I don't see you in these lights, make some noise. Yeah, I see you.
What about Playboy parties?
What about what?
Playboy parties, hip-hop parties.
I would have a hard time writing about hip-hop just because I know so little about it. I often think that I can write about anything because I'll just learn as I go. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I think also for hip-hop artists, you have to have enough time go by. Like, I wouldn't want to write about something too contemporary because you need a little bit of history, some time to pass to know how important they are. Like right now, some people might think that, Taylor Swift is really important. We won't really know for 20, 25 years. So I think that's something that I keep in mind. I try not to write about anything too contemporary. But I think there's going to be a lot of great hip-hop biographies that are going to need to be written in the in the future. Some of them, if you look at the birth of hip-hop, that's in the 70s and 80s. Enough time has gone by. We could write about that for sure. There's probably some good biographies already coming out about the early hip-hop generation. Yeah.
Was there like a specific moment where you felt very accomplished that you followed with your writing career and like how well you did it?
I'm sorry, could you say it a little louder?
I'm saying like was there like a specific moment where you felt very accomplished that you followed with your writing career and how well you did it?
Well, I always feel like proud of my accomplishments. Getting a book published and seeing it in the store, and my first book made the New York Times bestseller list. I felt great, but I always still feel like now I got to do it again, and I got to do it even better. And as I take on bigger subjects like Martin Luther King, I feel like I have even more pressure to perform. But winning the Pulitzer was pretty. It was definitely. I think I'll sleep well at night from now on with that for sure.
Up here in the center.
Yes. You don't really get well. What happens is the publisher sends in. They send in hundreds of books like that, and then a committee reads hundreds of books and picks a winner and picks a bunch of finalists. But you don't know that you're nominated. You don't know you're a finalist. They don't invite you to an award ceremony like the Grammys or like the Oscars where they open the envelope. None of that happens. You just find out one day. There was a live stream on YouTube, and they announced that I was the winner, but I had no idea that it was coming. So it was a really amazing surprise. Any more questions? Yes. Hi. Okay. Well, good question. I was working at the Wall Street Journal, and I wrote my Lou Gehrig book in my spare time, nights and weekends. And then when I had an idea for another book, I asked them if they would give me a year off to work on the book, and they agreed to give me a year off. And then I went back to my job, and I had an idea for another book, and I decided to quit. And I always thought, if the book thing doesn't work out, I can try to go back to newspapers. But then the newspaper industry began to die anyway, so I figured I better stick with books. And I've been lucky. Not very many people can write biographies full time and make a living at it. Most of them have to take a teaching job or something on the side. But I'm only able to do it because my wife has a job, and we have one steady source of income, and we have health insurance that way. Because even now, if you think about it, it takes me 5 or 6 years to write a book. So even if they gave you, hundreds of thousands of dollars, you got to make that last over the course of several years, 5 or 6 years, and you pay all your own expenses, all your own travel. You don't have health insurance. It's not an easy way to make a living, but it's a lot of fun. I think I saw another hand up there. Yes. Wow, that's great. Is there anything I found universal about the human condition? I think these great figures, these people like Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King, unfortunately so far my books have all been about men, except for some of the people involved in the invention of the birth control pill. But I think these titanic figures who think they can change the world, they're instilled with something that makes them think they're special. And look, we all think we're special, right? We're the only conscious we know. But they have something that makes them think that they could really be special and they could challenge authority, that they could change the world. And sometimes that just comes from like having a parent who believes in you. Sometimes it comes from having a parent who doesn't believe in you. So I don't know that there's any one thing that they all have in common, except that they were willing to fail and willing to suffer because they thought that what they were doing was so important. Yes. Yeah, I see you.
Do you think our government still exemplifies some form of censorship, or fear that maybe that's part of the change?
Do I think the government still is involved in censorship? Is that?
Like censorship and a fear of change.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I mean, ask yourself, why did the government go after King? It was because he wasn't threatening violence, obviously, but he was threatening a change in the status quo. He was saying that this power structure needed to be shaken up. And the FBI felt like the power structure was working really well for the people in charge. That, the white Christian nationalism had been very good to J. Edgar Hoover, and he wanted to see it preserved. And I still think that that's the case. I still think that's why a lot of people are afraid of change in this country, because they're in power and they don't want to share power. So that's the struggle, and I think that's always going to be the struggle in any kind of a democracy, is to be more democratic. Thank you. And we have books, if anybody wants a book or a picture.